They're slowly but surely building Chinese influence across the globe in many different areas. We're not seeing it. We're just not seeing it at all. China wants to be the world's economic superpower.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, former senior military intelligence officer Philip Ingram says the Chinese Communist Party is the world's biggest threat.
You don't spend billions and billions and billions of dollars developing that power projection capability unless you intend to use it, either use it to protect your territories overseas, China doesn't have any, or to take territory and to influence what's going on. That's the worrying bit.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders. I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with former senior military intelligence officer Philip Ingram. Philip, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here, Lee. Thank you for inviting me.
The Estonian Prime Minister said that Russia's conducting a shadow war against the West. I mean, the UK is not officially at war until the Prime Minister announces that, but are we unofficially at war?
Well, war is, you bandied around as a term. There has to be a declaration of war, a formal declaration of war for you to be legally at war. Are we in some form of conflict with Russia? Yes, and we have been for many, many years. It started at the end of the Second World War with the Cold War, and post-Cold War, whilst the West celebrated and thought Russia's our friend and everything else, Russia continued to do what it was doing in the grey zone, as people describe it. So from an intelligence perspective, an espionage perspective, and all the rest of it to try and maintain its levels of influence. And incidents that have happened in the UK, certainly over the past few years, the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko with polonium-210 on the streets of London, the poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia with Novichok nerve agent in Salisbury. Those you could consider are certainly hostile acts, if not acts of war, and that's continued in what's going on in the information operation and trying to influence things politically and from a business perspective and economically, not just in the UK, but when we were in the EU and within the EU and across in all the elections that are happening as well. The Russian knife of influence is being stuck into any crack it can get, and they're wiggling it to try and make those cracks bigger.
So we see a lot of reports about understaffing of our military, underfunding. Are we ready for something like this?
I think we're not ready is really simple, because it's been ongoing. We took our eye off the ball completely. We took our eye off the ball because we've started to focus from a military perspective onto operations that weren't high-intensity conflict operations, so Iraq, Afghanistan and the like, and that allowed the ability to prosecute high intensity. And what I mean by high intensity are operations where you're using heavy armour. What we're seeing between Russia and Ukraine at the moment is a high intensity operation, and you need a balance between your air forces, your naval forces and your land forces to be able to prosecute that sort of level of conflict that's on the edge of becoming a total conflict, and that's where all of the resources of a country are focused on one thing, and that's supporting your ability to prosecute that conflict. Ukraine is almost in that position at the moment. We're nowhere near it. But we also lost the intelligence game because we started to focus on counter-terror issues, and that took our security services focus away and everything else. And we thought Russia was our friend and they'd stop spying on us, and the same as China and elsewhere. But the realization has come home, and come home quickly. And defence has been hollowed out. But defence hasn't helped itself, because your senior generals, air marshals and admirals have gone along with it instead of recognising, and it's their job to advise and make sure that defence is capable of doing what the threats are. And we've got defence intelligence that's telling us what the threats are. We haven't seen any of those senior officers resign, so they've been quite happy to play with government policy instead of sticking their feet down and saying there's the red line militarily. If we go beyond that, I can't be here anymore. So it's we are not ready at the moment. We're starting to get ready, but too slowly, I think.
As a media consumer, it's quite difficult to know what's going on, really. I mean, is Ukraine winning? Is Russia winning? Are we at the start of the conflict? Are we nearing the end? Why is that?
that's because a lot of people don't understand the complexities of war. If you look at what's going on the front line from a very one-dimensional perspective, Russia is winning at the moment, because Russia has got the initiative. It is gaining ground, albeit very, very slowly. Therefore, it's moving forward in its objectives. It's just captured that piece of territory to the northeast of Kharkiv, and is making further advances in the eastern part. Ukraine is holding them, but last year, whenever and the year before, just after Russia started its special military operation, its re-invasion of Ukraine, and it failed to take Kyiv, it failed to topple the Zelensky government, it failed to capture Ukraine politically or militarily, and it stimulated two other countries to join NATO. Putin lost his strategic objectives first and foremost, and then they lost their tactical objectives, being pushed back from Kyiv and being pushed right into the east. And then Ukraine started its counteroffensive last summer too early. They didn't have the kit, they didn't have the capability ready to do that. And Russia blunted it. Kyiv's licking its wounds slightly, but it didn't have the wherewithal because of the hiatus in supplies coming from the United States for domestic political reasons. And therefore they're holding the Russians in place. That's the front line. So Ukraine would be losing there. If we look at it from a conflict, from an overall perspective, Putin's lost. He's lost all of his strategic objectives, so he's floundering to try and find something. So he was trying to pressurize the world by influencing the grain outflow from the Ukrainian ports so that he'd bring it into the global implications. He's lost, almost 50% of his Black Sea fleet. He can't do that anymore. So he's lost that, and that's an operational level loss. And then what we're seeing are the Ukrainians attacking Russian oil production facilities. They're attacking Russian railways. They're attacking Russian airfields, albeit at a relatively lowish level, every 2 or 3 days. But they're having a massive effect on Russia's ability to continue to prosecute the war. They're hollowing Russia out from behind. And that takes a long time for the effects of that to work its way through to what's going on the front line. So from an operational perspective, Ukraine's got the initiative and are winning. From a tactical perspective, Russia currently has the initiative. But once you've hollowed everything out behind the tactical bit, in the front line, that no matter how strong that is, it will collapse at some stage. I remember at the end, there was an infamous interview at the end of the Vietnam War where there's a Viet Cong leader and a US general were debating, and the US general turned around and said, "We beat you in every tactical engagement that we ever came across." And the Viet Cong leader went, "Yes, so?" And we're seeing the same, I think, between Ukraine and Russia at the moment. But we're a long way off this conflict getting anywhere near an ending.
Really? So what's your prediction over the next few years?
Next few years, this year, I think, now that the ammunition's getting into the Ukrainians from the West, and we're seeing an awful lot more aid getting in, we're going to see the arrival of the F-16 aircraft, the long-awaited. That will have a massive effect on Ukraine's ability to prosecute the tactical battle, because they can protect their ground elements with a bubble of air superiority over it. And therefore, I think what we'll see this year is Ukraine stabilizing the front line, starting to push the Russians back, so starting to regain the initiative from a tactical perspective, but using the rest of this year to continue hollowing out from behind, to prepare and let their pilots understand how to fight the F-16s with other air assets and with other ground assets, and prepare the ground for a proper big counteroffensive, a big punch sometime in 2025, probably late spring, early summer. Whether that'll be enough to dislocate the Russian forces completely and push them out, it could do, but there's still a long fight ahead. So I think, in 2, 3, possibly 5 years, we're still going to be talking about this.
Right. We've recently seen Britain talk about expelling the Russian defense attaché over spying allegations. I mean, has the Ukraine conflict made the Russian interference in the UK less or more, or what effect has it had?
It's made it more. It's made the UK realise more of what Russia is involved in and has been involved in for years in the UK. To expel the Russian defence attaché, he's been caught with his fingers somewhere that his fingers shouldn't have been. You, the excuse was that he'd been involved in espionage. I'm sorry, all Russian defense attaches are intelligence officers, and all defense attaches from every country around the world in their embassy have got low-level intelligence gathering tasks and roles, and countries know they're doing that. So they're a declared unofficial intelligence office, intelligence capability. So that excuse doesn't wash with me at all. So he's been caught doing something that he should personally not have got involved in. Why he was doing it or not, I don't know. We'll probably never find out what the reality is. But we've then got the tit-for-tat expulsion because the UK defence attaché in Moscow is being expelled. We're back to good old Cold War tactics. Remember, there's lots of diplomats and intelligence officers expelled after the Sergei Skripal affair. A lot of those will have filtered back into the system again. But I don't think we probably recognise the intelligence networks that the Russian assets and Chinese assets and Iranian assets will have set up across the country. I remember after Sergei Skripal writing a little blog which entitled Salisbury, a sleepy hollow or a spook's paradise, and concluded that it was a spook's paradise because of everything that was going on around it, because of all the military facilities that were around, top secret facilities based in the area. It's the sort of thing that traditionally Russian intelligence services would be fascinated with. So I'm pretty certain there's been a Russian intelligence cell based somewhere in the Salisbury Plain area ever since the Cold War, if not during the Cold War. We haven't found it yet. Elements of it will have been involved in the Sergei Skripal attack. I'm pretty certain of that. But that will be all over the country around the different facilities that are there.
So how deep does this Russian involvement go? Can you kind of explain it to us, civilians? How does it manifest as well?
It manifests itself in many different ways.
Right.
And I look at it from what are the Russian targets? Because each country's got a different target and a different set of things it's after. Russia is paranoid about Western military, so it will be looking at military targets. It's looking at our military equipment. It's looking at how we operate our tactics. So it wants to observe our military exercises. It's looking at our command and control. It's looking at the intelligence that we've got. It's looking at the political decision making. So it will be looking at those that are involved in the political decision making and those that are involved in the military. It will use technical means to gather information. It will use human means to gather information. It will use traditional espionage means to gather information. So honey traps, finding compromise on individuals so that they can blackmail them to get them to pass information across the Russians. And they'll start off with low-level information, and they're trying to build up various pictures, and they'll do that sort of pixel by pixel. And you don't need a lot of information to form a pixel, but you put lots of pixels together and you can make a big picture. And they'll use all their different resources to do that. They'll go out and take photographs and build photographic montages of different establishments and secret establishments. It's all good old-fashioned traditional espionage techniques, but enhanced by what you then get in the cyber domain. So a lot of the cyber gangs that are out there are based in Russia, the advanced persistent threats. They don't necessarily work directly to the Russian government. Russian government's got its own cyber capabilities, but they're all out trying to steal as much information as they can, and they'll target government databases, and they'll target individuals that are working in different areas, or individuals that know people that are working in different areas.
So are they doing that for financial gain?
The criminal gangs are doing it for financial gain, but the tax, in inverted commas, that they pay to the Russian government for not being prosecuted and being allowed to carry out these activities they'll carry out tasks for the Russian government. So they'll try and break in and steal military secrets, whether they be designs of equipment or command and control or the report on a military operation or military exercises, or an understanding of what's going on between different personalities in command structures, so that they can look for opportunities to potentially try and get in and compromise people. So it's a complex intelligence game. It's one they haven't stopped at the end of the Cold War. If anything, they ramped it up, and we took our eye off the ball. So how much they've penetrated our different organisations and forces is very difficult to assess, but they certainly have done. And the Russians aren't the only ones at it. The Chinese are prolific at it as well. To a lesser degree, we've got the Iranians and other countries. And of course, everything that they're doing to us, we're trying to do to them.
Yeah. So Britain was always quite a popular destination for this oligarch money for quite a long time. Has this caused us problems now that the invasion has happened?
It should be causing us more problems. The UK was a destination for it because of the City of London. The regulation in the City of London is strong, but it's not the strongest around the world. It's easy for outside entities, and this is British policy. It's easy for outside entities to come and invest money into the UK stock market, into the UK housing market. How many of the valuable houses around London are owned by Russians? A large proportion of the estate, large chunks of the country in the UK are owned by Russians because it's very, very valuable land. And that's been there for such a long time. And the laws are such that if we try to change the laws to push them out, actually there's so many other high net worth investors from the Middle East or from China or from elsewhere that are investing in the same sort of areas. You then start to push them out, and the implications that would have on the London money markets and therefore the British economy and everything else that's living off it are huge. And that's what's very difficult for any government to try and get a handle on it and to deal with it. So they're having to sort of deal with your little individuals that are within it, where they can get their head above a parapet and find enough evidence. And again, getting the evidential trail from an international perspective takes huge police resources. The police don't have those resources to do it. And the criminal networks know that. And then they'll shift to something else that will potentially go through the UK, like cryptocurrencies or other things. So the criminal gangs have got so many more resources to be able to throw at making sure their criminality is above the threshold of where law enforcement can detect it and deal with it. We're always trying to play a catch-up game. We'll never win.
We recently saw Putin go and visit Xi Jinping. How concerned should people be at the strengthening bonds between these two regimes?
I think we should be extremely concerned. If we look at what's going on around the world, there are three real areas of conflict at the moment. We've got Russia-Ukraine, so Europe. We've got the increasing activity that's in the Middle East, that everything points back to Iran. Because it's all focused in there. Hamas, Hezbollah, the different groupings in Syria and Iraq, and the Houthis down in Yemen, are all backed by Iran. The Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, or the Quds Force element of that, specialises in making sure that their resources are there, the training's there, everything's there for all of these different groupings, all of these different groupings have got one aim: to form a wider caliphate where the Grand Ayatollah in Iran is at the centre of that caliphate. So that's brewing away in the background, and that's a major destabilising factor. But from a longer term perspective, China is the biggest threat, I think, by a long, long way. If you look at what China is doing in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, where it's taking sand spits, so sand bars that at low tide or an exceptional low tide may just be above the surface of the water, but most of the time they're covered by the sea. They've got no legal basis whatsoever under international law. There's two sets of islands there, the Paracel and the Spratly Islands. China has taken sand spits and put dredging units in and created artificial islands. Once you've got an island, and they put the Chinese flag in it, once you've got an island, you then got 12-mile territorial water on the outside and 200-mile area of economic influence. China's creating islands. It's creating Chinese territory in areas that it wants to have more interest over. And we've seen it just off the Philippines trying to do that. And we've seen the protests it puts out whenever we get US, UK, German, NATO warships carrying out freedom of navigation manoeuvres down through the Paracel and Spratly Islands and all of that area, because China wants to dominate it. And if you look from an economic perspective, what China's doing, it's effectively bought most of Africa. The rare earth metal mines that exist in Africa, all of the electronics and stuff that we have rely on rare earth metals.
Yeah.
All of the rare earth metals that we have in our electronics our electronics are reliant on them, and China's bought most of the mines. They bought a lot of the infrastructure across Africa. They have bought a lot of the mining output from Australia. They physically own the mines, and they're now moving into South America. They're slowly but surely building Chinese influence across the globe in many different areas. We're not seeing it. We're just not seeing it at all. China wants to be the world's economic superpower. It's number two at the moment, and its military is there to back that. It will do things politically and economically, but it will get to a point where it'll go, actually it's going to be quicker for us to do this with a little bit of military help, and ride out the sanctions and anything else that'll come, because we know that'll rocket us to the next level. And that's what's happened with China's takeover of Hong Kong and removal of the two-state position that was there. This was what China's trying to do with the pressure it's putting on Taiwan. It's what it's trying to do with pressure through other countries through the Middle East. It's what it's done in a lot of areas in Africa. And what really worries me is we're seeing China building what I class as power projection military capability. So that's the ability to take a military force, pick it up, move it somewhere, and do something with it.
Right.
It's really expensive and really complex. And core to that are aircraft carriers. China's just launched its third. It's got plans to produce more. They've modernized their military across the board. The exercise they're doing in the invasion of Taiwan, that could be an invasion of anywhere. You don't spend billions and billions and billions of dollars developing that power projection capability unless you intend to use it, either use it to protect your territories overseas. China doesn't have any. Or to take territory and to influence what's going on. That's the worrying bit. India is concerned about it because India has now just announced that it's going to build its third aircraft carrier and potentially build 5. Japan's worried about it because Japan has changed its constitution to allow it to take Japanese military forces outside Japan for the first time ever. Changed its constitution to allow it to turn a helicopter carrier it's got into an aircraft carrier, and they're buying F-35s to go onto that. And they've created a marine force that's got the ability to go out and hold some of the Japanese, or recapture some of the Japanese islands. Their wording on recapture is quite interesting because one of the Japanese Kuril Islands has been occupied by Russia since the end of the Second World War. So there's a lot of build-up going on in Southeast Asia at the minute that if you map that out against military build-up that happened pre-First World War, pre-Second World War, it's on the same path and of the same sort of scale. Not in timelines, but of the same sort of scale. That worries me. And then with the coming together, we're seeing Xi Jinping and Putin getting close together. We're seeing Xi Jinping, Putin and the Grand Ayatollah in Iran getting together. We're seeing Putin and Xi Jinping getting together with Kim Jong-un. We're seeing Putin relying on ammunition coming from North Korea with Kim Jong-un, and ammunition and drones and others coming from Iran. We've got an axis of leaders who are in position for life or longer. The regimes can continue longer. I can think in multi-generational terms, coming together in a way that they can oppose leaders who are having to think in presidential or prime ministerial or parliamentary terms. So 25 years as opposed to 3 to 5 years, but 3 to 5 years isn't that in reality. It's what tomorrow morning's headline is going to be. So we've got a proactive forward planning group trying to influence and get one step ahead of a group that is reactive. The proactive group will always win, and that's why I'm concerned.
It seems Western leaders always had a healthy suspicion of Russian leaders, but when it comes to China, they seem a bit happier to ignore the red flags. It's a friend with economic benefits. Do you think the West has the right kind of level of suspicion of China's threat?
I think suspicion's changed. I think when David Cameron was Prime Minister, he saw China as an economic opportunity. And therefore, because the Chinese like British goods, and he thought this will get us one step ahead in the international stakes, let's cozy up to China. As he was doing that, China was doing as China's always done and looked after its own self-interests and was looking at every opportunity to expand its economic understanding. And one of the ways it does that is it steals intellectual property. Why does it do that? Because if you're building something new or you're inventing something new, you tend to spend millions or billions inventing it and designing it and getting it all right and everything else. Then once you got the design, you start the manufacturing. Well, if China can manufacture without spending that billions in the development side of things, it's saving itself billions. It means the manufacture output can undercut those that are having to absorb the costs in the West of that development into what it is that they're selling. So China will sell technologies that are almost as good as anything that's coming out of the West, but at a fraction of the price, and that's because they haven't paid for the development of it. Very clever sort of economic policy, but it's sort of kind of illegal or immoral. And that's one of the issues. And we're seeing that in the pharmaceutical industry, we're seeing that in the high-tech industries, we're seeing that in defense industries. It's no coincidence that the latest Chinese fifth-generation fighter jet looks exactly like the US F-35. And they've got another one that looks like the US F-22 because they've nicked the plans. And they've been doing that the whole way through. And people are just beginning to realize that and realize how much China, from a national perspective, is paranoid about the West does and how much data it captures. And that's why we've seen changes in policy with regard to Huawei technology in our 5G networks. That's why we're seeing policies coming out to remove Chinese CCTV cameras, Hikvision, Dahua, and all the rest of it from government buildings and everything else. Because whenever you drill into it, a lot of these are just big data hoovers. An endpoint, something that's collecting information is a big data hoover. It's then where does that data go and get sit? Well, some of the CCTV companies will sell a cloud storage package with the cameras. It's optimized to work with everything else, and it's better value than anything else that's in the market. So commercially, lots of people go, yeah, I'll have that. But that data is sitting on servers in continental China. That means that the Chinese intelligence services can use that data live, because it's streaming in live, to monitor what they want to do and to run whatever software on top of it they want to run. So they can run AI facial recognition software and use it to track Chinese diaspora, Uyghurs, anyone else that they want to track live on the streets of London without the camera operators knowing that that's happening. That's kind of against everything that we understand from a GDPR and a surveillance oversight perspective and everything else. And we're just beginning to realize this. And that isn't into the then traditional espionage where you're still into the honey traps, the human intelligence and everything else that's going on. And that's happening across the board.
So we're talking about these dictatorial regimes. They're playing long games. They're planning generationally, whereas we're looking at kind of 4-year cycles. And they're happy to use methods that we wouldn't really use, immoral, illegal, etc. What do we need to do to counter this?
Well, the first thing is realization that's happening. The second thing is education. So it's educating all of those people that could be targets. I've been a target of Chinese intelligence, and I've written an article about it in the Times. But it's that realization and understanding whether you could be a target or not, and then it's getting into the basics of protecting yourself and where it is that you are and the influence that's there, and understanding that people are trying to steal a lot of the stuff that you've got or are trying to influence you or anything else. The genie's out of the bottle. You're never going to be able to grab that genie, squish it up again and put it back in through the neck of the bottle. So it's understanding what that genie is doing and where it is the hard bit. And it's a responsibility for everyone out there to recognise that this is going on and that a lot of people could be targets. And our intelligence services have recognised that now and have got a pretty good handle on a lot of what's going on, because everything has to go back to 1 or 2 points. So you'll get nodes where information or intelligence is fed into. And of course, we're watching the watchers, and they're watching the watchers that are watching the watchers, and we're watching. Yeah, so it goes on and on and on, and it's it's stimulated a big intelligence operation that's happening not just nationally but multinationally or internationally as well, and we cooperate with our international partners in this. But that has ramped itself up enormously now and is taking more and more resources, and those resources are not just human beings, because there's a lot of human beings involved, but it's electronic resources as well. So it's making sure we understand what's going on in cyberspace and can sit and watch it. Whenever I go out and give talks on cybersecurity, I always ask the cybersecurity professionals one question at the end, and I said, "What's the most effective cyber attack that is happening today?" They sit there and look at me and come up with different answers. They say, "It's the one that you don't know is in your network and is ongoing. That tends to be one that's gathering information, just sitting quietly, listening and sucking everything up, because it doesn't need to do anything. It just wants to listen. It's got in there, and it gets hold of what it wants."
We've seen recently allegations of spying for China against two British men, and there was a third kind of separate man who lost his life, but was allegations of spying for Hong Kong. How deep do you think this goes? Is this a tip of the iceberg?
Definitely the tip of the iceberg. It is throughout society. So you will find Article 7 of the Chinese National Intelligence Law requires every individual and every Chinese company to comply with Chinese intelligence services when requested to do so. So that means if a Chinese national is going back home to China and is stopped by immigration on the way in and said, "You are to come and tell us about this," or "You're to take this to such and such," or "You're to do that." If they don't do it, they'll get arrested for breaking national intelligence laws. If a company is asked to make sure that there's a backdoor in an electronic device, then if they don't comply, they're breaking national intelligence laws. So whenever the likes of ByteDance turns around, who own TikTok, turns around and says, no, we don't comply with anything that the government tells us to do. Well, the CEO of ByteDance, which is a Chinese company, is still the CEO of ByteDance and isn't in prison. So if he was doing what he says he's doing, then the Chinese authorities would have arrested him and he'd be in prison. So, from a commercial perspective, he has to say that. It's at every level, absolutely at every level, and everyone who's got a Chinese app on their telephone is potentially having the data, or their mobile device is potentially having that data sucked up. Because what China loves to do is it loves to hoover everything up, and it'll then take into its databases and use artificial intelligence techniques to sift through it. 99.99999% of what it sucks up is completely useless and gets ignored. But it's those little nuggets and the way those little nuggets get together. And whenever we get into the realm of quantum computing coming in, that will enable AI applications and generative AI applications to analyze the data. Then we're in a completely different game. We saw back in 2017 the furor that there was around Cambridge Analytica and its influence into our elections. There's been some research looking at taking manipulative marketing techniques and taking the analysis of big data and combining the two. You take big data, because of the way we live in this interconnected world and a lot of stuff about people's published out there, you can get to know people better than they know themselves by analysing individuals' posts or their friends' posts or their families' posts or other things. And you can tend to understand where people sit in a socio-economic perspective, where their political values are, or those that are around them political values are, and you can assume that they're naturally there. You can work out where people sit in the fence or don't sit in the fence. Then apply manipulative marketing techniques and targeted information into those influencers that there are to an individual. You can change that individual's view from sitting on the fence to being one side or the other. That was happening back in 2017. It's getting stronger and stronger and stronger, and we're just not realizing it at the moment. China is leading the way in that. Russia's pretty good at it too.
Do you feel optimistic that we've got the kind of systems in place to deal with all of this?
Ooh. In a word, no. I've been at this game analysing things from a geopolitical perspective from when I first joined the army right through to I'm doing now, and commentating on it for over 40 years. In that 40-year period, and even just before that, I was looking at it. 1983 was the year we came closest to a global nuclear war. It wasn't the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was 1983. Go on, if people want to do more research on that, Google Olev Gordievsky, and there's some fantastic books out there that will put all that into perspective. Even then, when it comes to now, I never saw a clear path to a global conflict. That was, the 83 was just one blip. But since then, I haven't seen a clear path to global conflict. I can now see several clear paths to global conflict. That doesn't mean that global conflict is inevitable. I am hesitant at the moment because this is a year of elections around the world, and we've got 60 different elections in this year across the globe, including some biggies like the US presidential election, like the UK general election, like the EU elections that are coming up next month, and all the rest of it. The outcomes for those will dictate how confident I am that our politicians and our political systems are in a place to try and diffuse what's going on around the world instead of inflame what's going on around the world. And therefore, I'd reserve my right to comment properly again at the end of the year or early next year, but I'm concerned at the moment.
Philip Ingram, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.